Good evening. Tonight we're going way back, not to marble palaces or thunderbolts in the sky, but to the old myths told under open stars, to the labors, the legends, and the long winding story of a man who was strong, yes, but also lost, flawed, and deeply human. This isn't a tale of glory shouted from mountaintops. It's one of burden, of effort, of endurance, the kind of quiet heroism that comes from simply carrying on. If stories like this help you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something strangely comforting about seeing all the places where these quiet stories reach. So dim the lights, settle in, let your thoughts slow, and let's begin at the beginning of a myth that somehow still matters. Let us begin gently, with a tale as old as temples and twilight, one nestled in the fold of myth, embroidered with the silk of ancient superstition, and dusted lightly as ever with the fingerprints of mortal confusion. This is the story of Hercules, or if you're partial to the Roman stylings, Hercules. But let us not rush. After all, you're likely listening to this in bed, and no one ever stormed Olympus with a yawn. Our tale begins not in the heavens but on earth in the city of Thebes, though even that name carries the usual haze of mythological vagueness. There a mortal woman named Alcmene lived. She was of noble blood, patient temperament, and crucially, married. Her husband, Amphitryon, was away at war, which in Greek mythology was always a bit like leaving the windows open in a thunderstorm. Something unexpected was bound to sneak in. Enter Zeus, or rather descends Zeus, king of the gods, storm-wielding, beard-flowing nymph pursuing Zeus, whose marital fidelity could best be described as conceptual. Zeus had taken a liking to Alcmene, not because she sought divine company, but because she didn't, and as Greek myth goes, that was practically an invitation. Zeus disguised himself as Amphitryon, returning from war a bit earlier than scheduled, and spent the night with Alcmene. He even stretched the night into 3, manipulating time as only a thunder god can, which seems excessive even by divine standards. Alcmene, unsuspecting, believed it was her husband, and thus the seed of a demigod was planted. The next morning, the real Amphitryon arrived. Understandably, Alcmene was confused. Amphitryon, too, was puzzled when she congratulated him on their romantic evening, which he hadn't yet had. Eventually, the truth unraveled like a poorly spun thread, and the whole affair, as one might expect, upset quite a few people, but none so much as Hera. Ah yes, Hera, queen of Olympus, wife of Zeus, long-suffering, sharp-eyed, and understandably furious. Though rarely at the correct target, her fury was rarely leveled at Zeus himself. Instead, it fell upon the women he pursued and the children born from these celestial indiscretions. And in this case, it fell squarely upon the unborn Hercules. Let us pause here for a moment of historical context. The Greeks believed their gods were not omnipotent in the way later religions framed divinity. The Olympians had strengths, yes, but also failings. Pettiness, jealousy, and a distressing lack of conflict resolution skills. They were, in essence, a divine soap opera, and Hera played her role with unmatched theatrical flair. When Hera learned of Alcmene's pregnancy, she did not simply fume in silence. No, she sought to prevent Hercules' birth altogether. She persuaded her daughter Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to delay the labor indefinitely. Alcmene, poor woman, was stuck in a loop of eternal contractions, an agonizing, magical stalemate. Fortunately, her servant Galanthus tricked Eileithyia by shouting that the child had been born, startling the goddess into loosening her spell, and thus Hercules entered the world. From the very beginning, he was no ordinary child. For one, he was enormous. Infant Hercules was said to have the strength of many grown men and the appetite of a small army. A rather inconvenient combination in a nursery. Hera, still determined to ruin his existence, devised another plan. One day, she sent 2 serpents into his cradle. Presumably, she hoped for a quiet assassination, but the infant, as the myth goes, grabbed one snake in each hand and strangled them. When his nurse returned, she found him gurgling contentedly, the serpents hanging limp like discarded toys. This story is one of the earliest recorded in the Hercules cycle, and it appears on vases and in early classical literature. One amphora from around 520 BCE shows Hercules gripping the snakes with exaggerated ease, while spectators stand aghast. Scholars suggest the tale served a dual purpose, entertaining the masses and illustrating divine strength from the very cradle. It also set the tone for what was to come. Hercules' life, from infancy to eventual apotheosis, would be a long negotiation between divine favor and divine punishment. He was beloved and reviled, blessed and cursed, the perfect mythological contradiction. Hercules was not an only child. Alcmene bore another son, Iphicles, sired by her actual husband, Amphitryon. So the household had twin boys, one divine, one mortal. You can imagine family dinners were slightly awkward. Iphicles, though brave and noble in his own right, would always live in his brother's formidable shadow. The Greeks, ever fond of metaphors, used this duality to explore themes of fate, lineage, and the blurry lines between man and God. Let us drift now to Hercules' childhood. As a youth, he was tutored by the finest minds in Greece. Chiron the centaur, wise and gentle, taught him medicine and music. Linus, a stern music master, tried to teach him the lyre, a standard part of noble education at the time. Unfortunately, Hercules had little patience for scales, and even less for correction. When Linus struck him for a mistake, Hercules responded by striking back with a lyre. The incident ended tragically, and Hercules was sent into exile for manslaughter. Greek legends are replete with such educational mishaps. Despite the setback, Hercules grew in strength and stature. He hunted lions, wrestled centaurs, and completed feats that would put any modern gym regimen to shame. One particularly early exploit included defeating a lion ravaging the plains of Cithaeron. He wore its skin thereafter, the same pelt often confused with the Nemean lions in later tales. Hercules was also known for his appetite, not just for food, but for experience. He drank deeply from the cup of life, often to the alarm of those nearby. One anecdote tells of him single-handedly finishing an entire banquet before the other guests had even arrived. Whether true or not, it cemented his image as larger than life in every conceivable way. Yet he was not without fault. His temper, in particular, was both legendary and dangerous, a flaw that would follow him throughout his life. The most tragic result of this flaw came in early adulthood. Hera, ever the patient strategist, struck again, not with serpents but with madness. One day, under her influence, Hercules lost all sense of reality. In his confusion and fury, he mistook his wife and children for enemies. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. By the time he returned to his senses, the palace was silent, his family gone. The horror of it shattered him, and so the strongest man in Greece fell not in war, but in his own home, felled not by enemy spear, but by a god's whispered curse. The Greeks called this ate, a ruinous madness sent by the gods. It was not simply misfortune. It was a moment of divine reckoning. Even heroes, it seemed, were not safe from collapse. Let us pause here, as the Greeks did, to consider the implications in myth. This was not merely a tragedy. It was a moral reckoning, a cosmic balancing. The Greeks believed strongly in miasma, the pollution of the soul. After such acts, Hercules, polluted by his crime, could not simply carry on. No feast, no prayer, no apology could erase such a stain. He needed purification. And purification for a Greek hero was never gentle. He traveled, broken and barefoot, to Delphi, where the oracle of Apollo sat, cloaked in smoke and mystery. It was she, through divine inspiration, who prescribed the cure: servitude. Specifically, Hercules was to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns for 12 years. Eurystheus, it must be said, was not the sort of man you'd hope to meet in a moment of personal crisis. Small of stature, large of ego, and arguably overfond of reclining while others labored, Eurystheus was a petty cousin of Hercules. And thanks to a twist of fate and a bit of Hera's meddling, it was Eurystheus, not Hercules, who inherited the throne of Mycenae. Being tasked to serve this particular man was a humiliation in itself, but that was the point. The Greek idea of catharsis, of cleansing, was not about dignity. It was about humility, suffering, and the slow climb back toward honor. And so the 12 labors were born. But before we catalog those feats of might and misery, let us linger here just a bit longer, because this chapter, this fall into madness, is foundational. It tells us that Hercules was not merely a brute force character. He was a man who had erred deeply, who had suffered consequences, and who had to earn his place not through birthright but through ordeal. Megara, by the way, is a figure often lost in the shadow of her husband. In some versions, she was spared the slaughter, living in exile or retreating to her father's kingdom. In others, her fate is final. Greek mythology, true to its oral tradition roots, is not a single narrative but a tapestry, frayed, knotted, and rewoven across generations. Hercules' crime appears in Euripides' tragedy, Hercules, the dark and powerful play that explores not only madness but the crushing aftermath. In it, Hercules returns from the underworld only to find that his family has been threatened by a tyrant. He saves them, only to be struck mad by Hera slaughtering those he just rescued. When he awakens, he contemplates suicide. It is his friend Theseus who persuades him to live, not as a god, but as a man who must endure. This theme, endurance, is key. Greek heroes were not saints. They were not meant to be. They were instead mirrors of human struggle at large. Courage wasn't the absence of failure. It was the willingness to rise again after falling. And what of Hera? It's tempting, of course, to cast her as the villain. And in the context of Hercules' life, she certainly seems antagonistic. But here, as with Hera too, there is context. In a world where divine men chased mortal women with alarming frequency and no consequences, her fury is a kind of divine protest. Misplaced, yes, misguided certainly, but also perhaps the only weapon available to a queen in a court of thunderous egos. The theme of divine madness as a tool of punishment runs deep in Greek thought. Even outside mythology, historical accounts reference dreams, visions, and sudden frenzies as forms of divine intervention. In this case, Hera weaponizes the very fabric of Hercules' mind, not merely to destroy his family but to force him into a lifelong cycle of guilt and redemption. There are visual echoes of this moment in ancient Greek vase art. A particularly striking red figure crater from the 5th century BCE shows Hercules in a wild, almost ecstatic frenzy, his face distorted, weapons flailing, surrounded by fallen forms. Scholars debate whether it depicts this episode, but the intensity of emotion, the divine storm within, is unmistakable. His descent into madness also invites comparisons with other mythic figures. Ajax the Great, for instance, another hero who succumbs to madness and slaughters livestock, believing them to be his enemies. When he realizes the truth, he takes his own life. But Hercules, for all his suffering, chooses the harder path, to live. After his consultation at Delphi, Hercules submitted to his fate. The next 12 years of his life would be defined not by his lineage, nor by his ambitions, but by his obedience to a cousin who couldn't have lifted his lion pelt if he tried. The irony would not have been lost on the Greeks. It was meant to sting. Hercules was not sent to war or handed a sword. He was given a list, the labors that would follow. Slaying, fetching, cleaning, capturing. Each came with its own trap, its own sting in the tail. Some were meant to humiliate, others to kill, and all of them were intended to break him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. There is, in fact, a faint but curious echo of this structure in modern literature and cinema. The hero who falls, the self-imposed exile, the slow path to redemption. From Arthurian knights to Shakespearean kings, from comic book titans to tragic anti-heroes, the blueprint is still there. And it begins so often with a fall, not from battle but from within. Even in early Christian traditions that emerged later, echoes of Hercules' arc can be found. The notion that redemption is earned through suffering, that strength lies not only in might but in submission, in endurance, in service. Hercules, later worshipped, often emphasized this redemptive arc. At sanctuaries in places like Thebes and Thasos, votive offerings often included miniature clubs and lion skins, symbols not just of strength but of trials overcome. Pilgrims prayed not for ease, but for the strength to endure difficulty, just as Hercules had. His myth inspired the Stoics of the Roman period too. The philosopher Seneca referenced Hercules frequently, not as a brute, but as a moral figure, one who suffered nobly, who bore pain with grace, and who showed that virtue, in the end, could triumph over even divine spite. So if by this point in the night your eyes are heavy and the room quiet, let us leave Hercules in a moment of stillness, his past in ruins, his path unclear, his sandals dusty, the horizon distant but not impossible. The labors await, and so perhaps does sleep. Let us return now to the crossroads of fate, where Hercules, cloaked in guilt and burdened by divine command, is about to begin what may be the most famous checklist in mythological history. The 12 labors of Hercules, epic in scope, improbable in detail, and oddly specific, each one a test, each one a punishment, and each one stitched into the great tapestry of redemption. We begin with the arrangement itself. Hercules was ordered to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns, not as a courtly guest or honored cousin, but as a servant, and not just any servant, a servant doomed to carry out the most unmanageable, humiliating, and downright bizarre tasks the king could imagine. These labors, in a sense, were bureaucratic justice with a poetic twist, redemption by way of impossible errands. The first labor, the Nemean lion. This lion was not merely large, it was invincible. Its golden fur could not be pierced by arrow, blade, or spear. Local villagers had resigned themselves to being an occasional snack. Hercules ventured into the lion's cave with nothing but a club and a clever mind. After realizing his weapons were useless, he wrestled the beast with his bare hands, ultimately strangling it. Then, in a moment of delightful practicality, he used the lion's own claw to skin it. From that point forward, he wore the hide as armor, a sartorial choice both symbolic and intimidating. A lion's pelt draped over his shoulders, the mane forming a makeshift hood, would become one of his most iconic attributes in classical art and statuary. Next came the Lernaean Hydra. The Hydra was a water serpent with 9 heads, or perhaps more, depending on the storyteller. And for every head cut off, 2 grew in its place. A rather discouraging design feature. To make matters worse, it lived in a swamp near Lerna, and its breath was poisonous. Hercules attacked with sword and fire while his nephew Aeolus burned the neck stumps before they could regenerate. Teamwork, it turns out, is a heroic quality too. Hera, watching from Olympus, was so annoyed she sent a giant crab to help the Hydra. Hercules crushed it. The gods later turned both monsters into constellations because even petty divine interference deserves a commemorative sky plaque. The third labor was far less glamorous, cleaning the Augean stables. King Augeas owned a vast herd of immortal cattle. Their stables hadn't been cleaned in decades. The result, as one might imagine, was less than fragrant. Hercules, showing ingenuity, rerouted 2 rivers to wash the stables clean in a single day. Unfortunately, because he had bargained for payment, Eurystheus disqualified the feat. Evidently, divine redemption cannot be monetized. Yet this labor marked a shift. Hercules was no longer merely a brute, but an engineer. The feat was cited centuries later by Roman authors as an example of problem-solving by force of nature. Labor 6, the Stymphalian birds. These were no ordinary birds. They had metallic feathers that could be launched like arrows and a call sharp enough to shatter glass. Hercules used a set of bronze castanets provided by Athena, no less, to startle them into flight, then shot them down with arrows. A solution both theatrical and effective. The scene was later depicted in mosaics and temple friezes, with Hercules mid-shot, surrounded by flocks of unnatural birds. Let us pause here for a moment. By this point in the saga, Hercules has proven not just his strength, but his adaptability. He solves problems with muscle and mind, with fire and music, with a stubbornness that verges on philosophical. Each task has added a layer to his myth. A golden hide, a nephew's loyalty, a river's cooperation. Labor 7. The Cretan bull. This majestic, ferocious beast had been sent by Poseidon, but King Minos of Crete had refused to sacrifice it. Bad manners, especially where sea gods are concerned. Hercules wrestled the bull and shipped it off to Eurystheus, who promptly let it roam free again, as one does with sacred livestock. Some believe this same bull would later be involved in the myth of the Minotaur, a narrative that, like all things Greek, folds in on itself like a well-baked spanakopita. The 8th labor, The mares of Diomedes. These were man-eating horses. Truly, Hercules tamed them by feeding them their own master, Diomedes. The horses, possibly surprised by the dietary switch, became suddenly docile. Moral complexity aside, it worked. The horses were led away peacefully. In some versions, the horses were taken to Mount Olympus as a gift, though one suspects the gods had mixed feelings about the snack options. The ninth task was almost civilized: retrieving the girdle of Hippolyta. Hippolyta was queen of the Amazons and possessed a magical belt given to her by Ares. At first, she agreed to give it freely. But Hera, ever meddlesome, disguised herself and spread rumors that Hercules intended to kidnap the queen. A battle broke out. Hippolyta died, and Hercules took the belt. What could have been an easy trade became a tragic misunderstanding, one of many in his journey. The Amazons, in turn, became a recurring foil in Greek tales, both feared and admired, warriors from a world where power wore a different face. The 10th labor, the cattle of Geryon. Geryon was a three-bodied giant who lived at the western edge of the world. Hercules had to travel beyond the known world, perhaps as far as Iberia, and retrieve the cattle. Along the way, he built the Pillars of Hercules, modern-day Strait of Gibraltar. To mark his journey, he slew Geryon, stole the cattle, and crossed the desert. At one point, annoyed by the heat, he shot an arrow at the sun. Surprisingly, the sun god Helios admired his boldness and gave him a golden cup to sail across the sea. One wonders how many sun gods today reward good archery with nautical gear. It's the kind of myth that walks the line between grandeur and absurdity, perhaps intentionally so. The 11th task, the apples of the Hesperides. These golden apples were guarded by nymphs and a dragon. Hercules didn't even know where they were. He sought the help of Prometheus, then persuaded Atlas to retrieve the apples while Hercules held up the sky in his place. When Atlas tried to shirk his burden permanently, Hercules tricked him into taking it back. A rare moment where strength alone would not do. The weight of heaven, it seems, requires a little cunning. In artistic depictions, Hercules is often shown literally holding up the firmament. No small feat, even for someone who once strangled a lion with his bare hands. And at last, the 12th labor, capturing Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades, the gatekeeper to the underworld. Hercules descended into the realm of the dead, negotiated with Hades himself, and brought Cerberus to the surface without using weapons. Once presented, the fearsome creature was returned to the underworld as agreed. This task, crossing into death and returning again, elevated Hercules beyond mortal boundaries. He was no longer just a hero. He was now a figure who had faced death and emerged, snarling companion in tow. With this final act, Hercules' labors came to an end. 12 tasks, each monstrous in its own way. Together, they formed a mythological resume unmatched in antiquity. But more than that, they served a purpose. In completing them, Hercules purified himself not only of his crime but of his rage, his pride and his grief. He had done the impossible, not once but a dozen times. And through it all he grew, not only as a hero but as a figure worthy of worship. In ancient Greece, these tales weren't just stories. They were metaphors for life's struggles, its messes, its monsters, its misunderstandings. And Hercules, through blood and cleverness, showed that even the cursed can find redemption. His labors became a common reference in classical oratory, especially among Stoic philosophers. They pointed to his struggles as allegories for mastering passions and enduring hardship. The Roman poet Seneca even argued that Hercules' immortality came not from his divine parentage, but from his moral perseverance. Each labor wasn't just a feat, it was a facet of character. And so, by fire and blood, by river and sky, by lion and lyre and labyrinthine task, Hercules emerged transformed, still flawed, still fated, but no longer fallen. So if your eyes are growing heavy and your breath has slowed, rest easy knowing that even the strongest among us must sometimes clean a stable or chase a deer through the woods for a year. Strength, after all, is not just in the arm but in the will to continue. Hercules had completed the 12 labors, not survived them, completed them. There's an important difference. For while survival is passive, Completion implies intention, purpose, a stubborn commitment to seeing things through. And that, in essence, was what Hercules had proven. He wasn't just strong, he was relentless. Now, with his penance concluded, he stood before the world no longer a murderer in need of purification, but a legend in his own lifetime. His name, once burdened by guilt, now shimmered with mythic resonance. And yet, because this is Greek mythology, peace would not follow. What followed instead was fame, and fame, as it turns out, is a fickle beast. Hercules' story did not stop with his labors. In fact, in many ways, they were just the beginning. The Greeks, ever fond of a good sequel, filled his post-labor life with new feats, fresh tragedies, and a growing awareness that glory could be as heavy to bear as guilt. He returned to Thebes but did not stay. Whether due to shame, restlessness, or divine suggestion, he began wandering. And wherever Hercules wandered, tales followed. He fought battles not listed among his labors, wars not sung about in epic poems. He toppled tyrants, hunted monsters, and even founded cities, or so the stories go. It's difficult, of course, to know where the real Hercules ends and the embroidered myth begins. But perhaps that was always the point. He ventured far beyond the Greek mainland, to Libya, where he is said to have bested Antaeus, a giant who could not be defeated so long as he remained in contact with the earth. Hercules, with practical brilliance, lifted him into the air and crushed him. A fine metaphor, if you like, for learning to outwit even the most grounded adversary. He traveled to Egypt, where one story claims a certain King Busiris attempted to sacrifice him, only to be sacrificed himself in short order. Hercules was not fond of surprises. He journeyed to the northern forests and the shores of the Black Sea, places where even Greek sailors whispered of cold winds and stranger gods. He was, in many ways, the first truly pan-Hellenic hero, a figure whose legend expanded with every ship that left port and every tale told over wine. Local myths absorbed him like water into sponge. In Egypt, he was associated with Ereshaf, a warrior god with ram's horns, worshipped at Heracleopolis Magna, the great city of Hercules. In this Egyptian form, Hercules lost none of his power, but he gained a touch of majesty. No longer the wild, brawling hero of Greece, he became a figure of wisdom, even kingship, a god of renewal and rulership. It is always fascinating to watch how cultures, when handed the same myth, choose to interpret it, not by its original logic, but by their own need. In the East, among the Persians and later the Indians, the Greeks introduced him as part of their imperial storytelling. After Alexander the Great swept across the known world from Macedonia to the Indus River, he brought with him not only armies, but iconography, coins bearing the lion-headed visage of Hercules, temples with columns shaped like clubs. In India, some scholars believe Hercules may have influenced or been conflated with figures such as Vishnu or Krishna, particularly in the Greco-Buddhist kingdoms where Hellenic and Indian cultures overlapped. In Gandhara art, that haunting fusion of Greek realism and Buddhist serenity, we sometimes find figures who look suspiciously like Hercules guarding stupas, standing beside bodhisattvas, lion skin slung casually across their shoulders. He had, it seems, become a guardian of thresholds, a protector no longer wrestling monsters in the swamps of Argos, but keeping watch at the edge of enlightenment. And then there is the West, the Roman West, where Hercules truly reached his second life. The Romans, practical and deeply fond of useful gods, renamed him Hercules, and made him a patron not just of strength but of travelers, merchants, and military men. He was no longer a penitent figure trying to atone. He was a symbol of virtues, of active excellence, of triumph by effort. His club was less about violence now and more about steadfastness. Temples to Hercules appeared in Carthage, in Spain, in Gaul, and across Britannia. Roman soldiers carved his name into altars along Hadrian's Wall. Even as far north as the Rhine and Danube, his story endured. A Mediterranean hero now clad in the mists of barbarian lands. He was not just a god but a tool of empire. His labors became metaphors for imperial conquest. Just as Hercules had tamed the wild world in his myths, the boar, the lion, the stables, so too did Rome imagine itself taming the wilderness beyond its borders. But beneath the grandeur, Hercules still retained his complexity. Romans told jokes about him. They painted him in taverns, sometimes drunk, sometimes asleep, sometimes wrestling pigs instead of giants. He became, oddly enough, a figure of affection, more human than many of their distant, aloof gods. In Hispania, modern-day Spain and Portugal, Hercules was said to have founded Gades, the Pillars of Hercules. Those two mythical rocks on either side of the Strait of Gibraltar marked the edge of the known world. Non plus ultra, they said, nothing further beyond. A neat reminder that even the strongest man in legend had limits. And then, perhaps inevitably, Hercules passed into story. As the Roman Empire waned, Christianity rose, and like many pagan figures, Hercules was gently repurposed. Not entirely discarded, but no longer worshipped. In medieval texts he appeared not as a god, but as a cautionary tale. A strong man, yes, but one undone by pride or lust or wrath. The same traits that once made him heroic, now made him tragic. Still, he would not disappear. In the Renaissance, that great rebirth of classical knowledge, Hercules came roaring back. Artists painted him with glowing skin, rippling muscles, eyes cast upward in stoic determination. Writers invoked him in Latin verse. Philosophers used him to argue for the nobility of struggle. Michelangelo sculpted him. Rubens painted him. In Florence, he became a civic symbol, the strong man who defends the city from chaos. A very localized Hercules, you might say, complete with Florentine fashion and political nuance. In the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers adopted him again, this time as a symbol of reason triumphing over superstition. The Hydra became ignorance. The stables became the corrupt institutions of church and state. The metaphor evolved, but the shape remained. And then, in the 20th century, something altogether different happened. Hercules went to Hollywood. He was played by bodybuilders, by Italians in sandals, by the occasional animated demigod with a singing satyr for a sidekick. He appeared in comics, in serials, in commercials, in gym names. His strength became a marketing tool, his labors a convenient plot device. And yet even there, beneath the muscle, the cheese, the fanfare, something of the old Hercules remained. He was still flawed, still funny, still, in his way, trying to do the right thing. He became whatever each era needed. A god in Egypt, a hero in Rome, a saintly sufferer in Byzantium, a cartoon in California. His adaptability is his power. Not just his strength, but his resonance. The way he fits into every age because he is, at heart, not just divine but recognizably human. A man who made mistakes, who lost his temper, who regretted things, who tried to fix them, who sometimes succeeded and sometimes didn't. In this way, Hercules has become not just a myth but a mirror. We see in him the best of us, and at times the worst. We see the burdens we carry, and the hope that we might one day put them down. We see the struggle, the exhaustion, the final rest. So when we say Hercules around the world, we are not merely mapping the places he touched. We are tracking the ways he continues to matter. In philosophy, in art, in quiet metaphors we don't always realize we're using. To call someone Herculean is to name them strong, yes, but also determined, dogged, capable of facing the thing no one else will face. And that, perhaps, is the truest legacy of all. Not the temples, not the films, not the myths carved in fading marble, but the idea that strength is not about being untouched by hardship, but about facing it anyway, quietly, relentlessly, kindly. So wherever you are tonight, be it under electric light or ancient stars, know that the man who once wrestled giants now waits gently in your story too. And maybe when things feel too heavy to lift, you'll remember him and try anyway. Rest now, listener. The world can wait. The next labor begins in the morning. Tonight you sleep. Stories end, but not all at once. Some fade gently, like candlelight at the bottom of a glass. Others echo for so long they forget how to stop. And some, a rare few, keep walking long after the last sentence has been spoken. Hercules, or Heracles as he was first named, is one such story. He began, as many Greek heroes did, in contradiction. Part god, part man, born of an illicit affair between Zeus and a mortal woman, hated by the queen of the gods before he could even speak, loved by many, feared by more, and tasked with redeeming himself through deeds so difficult they have never been forgotten. We followed him through it all. The snake in the cradle, the labors that pushed the edge of a world, the moment of madness, the wrestling matches with river gods and monsters and grief itself, the poisoned robe, the flames, the ascent, the uneasy peace. But even after 10 chapters and thousands of words, the question lingers, why does he endure? Not just in temples and textbooks, not just in the pages of epic poems or the flickering frames of Saturday morning cartoons, but in us. Why is Hercules still here? In our metaphors, our gyms, our dreams, our quiet inner dialogues. It is not, I think, because of his strength. Strength is everywhere, in myth. Titans held up the sky. Cyclops hurled boulders. Achilles was swift. Odysseus was clever. Theseus was brave. But Hercules was different. Not for what he could do, but for what he had to do. And more importantly, for what he endured doing it. The Greeks never pretended Hercules was perfect. He was impulsive, unpredictable. He killed when he shouldn't have. He wept when others might not have. He begged for help. He made mistakes and spent years paying for them. And yet, despite all of it, he kept going. That, more than the lion skin or the club, is the true shape of his legacy, perseverance. The Greeks had a word for this, karteria, endurance, the ability to suffer well, to bear the unbearable, to carry your guilt on your back like a sack of stones and still climb the mountain, to scrub stables when the stench is overwhelming, to battle hydras knowing they only grow more heads, to take on tasks you didn't ask for, to clean up the mess left by others, and to do so not because it will make you famous but because it needs to be done. Hercules became a vessel for these ideas. He was not the hero of victory. He was the hero of effort. The Stoics saw this clearly. For them, he was not just muscle. He was moral fiber. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, doesn't name Hercules directly, but you can feel him in the emperor's tone. You must build up your life action by action and be content if each one achieves its goal as far as possible. And no one can keep you from this. That, in essence, is the life Hercules lived. Not clean, not easy, not without error, but persistent, and in persistence something divine, even in death, or apotheosis depending on your view. Hercules didn't settle into stillness. He wasn't transformed into some aloof, distant deity, drifting on clouds, sipping ambrosia in bored omniscience. He remained active, invoked, present. In Thebes, athletes poured oil over altars in his name. Wrestlers rubbed their arms and whispered prayers to him. Soldiers drew his lion's head on their shields, not because they expected invincibility, but because they needed courage. Traders left offerings before long journeys. Even ordinary people, those not kings or warriors or philosophers, saw in him someone who knew what it was to toil. There is comfort in that, to imagine that a figure so mighty still understood hardship, that even gods once had to suffer through long days and difficult choices, that the divine could emerge not just from miracles but from repetition, from resilience. He also changed over time. That too is part of his strength. He became what people needed him to be. To the Greeks, he was the flawed mortal trying to be better. To the Romans, he was the empire's brawny cousin, civilized and assured. To the Christians of late antiquity, he became a sort of pagan penitent, one who suffered for past sins and emerged transfigured. In the Renaissance, he returned as the ideal man, strong of body, bold of spirit, occasionally nude in marble but always upright. In the modern world, he became the archetype of the hero's journey. Trials, growth, triumph, even when the names had changed. You've seen him, even when you haven't noticed. He's there in the firefighter pushing through smoke, in the parent working 2 jobs, in the student pulling another all-nighter, hoping for a future that feels just out of reach, in the athlete trying again, in the heartbroken healing slowly. He's not just in the mighty, he is in the struggling, and he has always been. Because Hercules, as myth speaks, not to our fantasies, but to our exhaustion. He tells us, yes, it is hard. Yes, you have made mistakes. Yes, you are tired. But go on anyway. Do the next labor. Wrestle the next beast. Clean the next stable. Try again. And if you fail, well, even Hercules failed sometimes. The ancient Greeks, for all their dramatics, understood this quietly. Their temples to him were often built on roadsides, at crossroads, at city gates, places where travelers passed through, burdened by distance, by trade. by fear. They prayed not just to be strong but to keep going. They left offerings of oil and muscle balm and simple food. They asked for patience, for courage, for rest, and not just in Greece. Along Roman roads in the forums of Spain and Gaul, on the windswept borders of Britannia, his name traveled not with spectacle but with quiet reliance. He became a sort of spiritual companion, the god not of thunder but of the weary nod at the end of the day. It's telling, I think, that Hercules never became the god of conquest, not of war, not of kingship, but of effort, of survival, of the weary hero who just kept going. His image appeared on vases, in temple carvings, in the minds of poets and orators. The Romans gave him temples. The Byzantines later would reinterpret him. And even today, his story echoes in comic books, in muscle-bound heroes on silver screens, in metaphors about impossible labors and the strength to carry on. For Hercules did not simply fight monsters. He fought himself, his impulses, his rage, his guilt, and in the end he emerged scarred, burned, perhaps even a little wiser, but at peace. Not all heroes are crowned in olive leaves. Some are crowned in flame. Some find heaven not through purity but persistence. And so we leave him not on the pyre, not in Olympus, but somewhere in between, still walking perhaps in the twilight lands of memory, still a figure of strength and sorrow, of justice and error. His labors are done, yours, dear listener, are too. Close your eyes and sleep. The story of Hercules, one might think, had reached its divine conclusion. He had been granted immortality, welcome to Olympus, and wed to Hebe, goddess of eternal youth. A fitting ending for a life stitched with pain, muscle, and flame. But Greek myth has never been particularly good at letting things lie. Even gods are restless, it seems. And though Hercules had ascended, stories of his deeds on earth continued to ripple outward like aftershocks from a long-forgotten quake. You see, the Greeks did not confine their heroes to neat narrative boxes. They allowed them to stretch, to contradict, to reappear. And so Hercules, though now divine, remained curiously involved in mortal affairs. His cults grew. His adventures were expanded upon. Entire cities claimed his presence. And in many places he was more than remembered. He was still active, a hero who, despite his apotheosis, never quite stopped moving. This chapter, then, is not a single tale. It's a patchwork of lesser-known stories drifting between myth and cult, between whispered legend and formal ritual. Hercules, the errant god, who could never quite stay put. To begin with, there is the curious matter of Hercules and Prometheus. Prometheus, as you may recall, had a rather unfortunate time after stealing fire for humanity. Zeus, in a mood perhaps best described as eternally displeased, chained him to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains. There an eagle, large, persistent, and presumably quite satisfied with its career choice, devoured his liver daily, only for it to grow back again each night. This was divine punishment with a certain gruesome poetry to it. And then one day, Hercules came along. No grand motive is given. He was simply passing through, as gods and heroes often do in these tales, and found Prometheus still bound, still bleeding, still waiting. Hercules, ever practical, took up his bow and shot the eagle. Just like that. One arrow. Then he broke the chains. Zeus, surprisingly, allowed it. Perhaps moved by the heroic gesture, or perhaps simply tired of the entire affair. It is a striking episode. Hercules, the mortal-turned-god, liberating the titan who had championed mankind. Two rebels meeting briefly at the edge of myth, one lifting the burden of the other. It's the kind of tale that doesn't roar. It hums quietly, persistently. Not long after, Hercules found himself embroiled in another conflict. This time against a certain king, Laomedon of Troy. The king, as kings often are in Greek myth, was both proud and dishonest. He had promised Hercules a reward, horses to be specific, if the hero would rescue his daughter Hesione from a sea monster. Hercules, of course, obliged. He slew the creature, saved the girl, and then was promptly told that the reward would not in fact be given. This was a mistake. Hercules returned later with an army, sacked the city, and killed Laomedon. In the chaos, he handed his bow to her choice of suitor. She picked Telamon, Hercules' comrade. Together, they would become ancestors to Ajax, one of the greatest heroes of the Trojan War. Thus Hercules inadvertently and indirectly helped set the stage for a conflict at Troy. not by prophecy or divine manipulation, but by getting cheated out of some horses and deciding quite reasonably that he had better things to do than accept royal ingratitude. Another tale, less dramatic but no less telling, takes place in the land of Lydia. Here, Hercules entered into a curious period of servitude. He was, according to legend, sold as a slave to Queen Omphale. The reasons for this vary. Some say it was punishment for a murder, not his first, nor his last. Others suggest it was a kind of penance enforced by the gods to teach humility. What's more interesting is what happened during this period. Omphale, unlike most Greek queens, was not content to let a demigod stomp about smashing things. She put him to work, and not in the usual Herculean fashion. He was made to do spinning, weaving, domestic chores. In some versions, she even dressed in his lion skin and carried his club while Hercules wore her clothes and jewels. Now one could view this as comic inversion, and certainly ancient vase painters had a field day with it. But there's something more here, a softening, a hero stripped of his tools, his temper, his public image, a glimpse of the man beneath the lion hide, or perhaps more accurately, a suggestion that heroism need not always roar. Sometimes it simply folds laundry. It's a reminder, too, of the Greek fascination with role reversal, with flipping the expected order of things, if only to see what happens. Omphale, strong and shrewd, ruling over the strongest man in myth, Hercules, still formidable, submitting not out of weakness, but out of something almost like curiosity. And then there were the small interventions, tales too minor for epic but too persistent to vanish. He helped the Argonauts in some versions. Though he did not complete the voyage, he was present at Calydon. Though the spotlight was mostly on Meleager and the famous boar. He trained warriors, advised kings, and occasionally settled scores that no one else could. In Boeotia, he was said to have founded the Olympic Games, though that honor is also claimed by Pelops and even Zeus himself. Still, Hercules' presence at Olympia became fixed in the cultural imagination. Statues of him adorned the gymnasia. Wrestlers poured libations in his name before matches. He was not just remembered, he was present, invoked in the sweat and struggle of athletic glory. And in the Roman world, he was reinvented again. Hercules, as the Latin tongue called him, was no longer a rough, guilt-haunted wanderer. He became a civic hero, a builder of temples, a protector of roads, a patron of trade. Merchants prayed to him for safe passage. Soldiers marched under his image. Emperors draped themselves in his iconography. Even Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, admired him, writing of strength and endurance in tones that echoed the Heraclean model. But this was a different Hercules. Polished, politic, smiling in marble. The raw, impulsive man who had once burned on a pyre was now a mascot of virtue. Still powerful, still noble, but one might argue slightly airbrushed. And yet he remained compelling across centuries, cultures, and reinterpretations. The figure of Hercules persisted, not because he was perfect, quite the opposite, because he was human. For all his strength he failed. For all his divinity he doubted. He raged, loved, mourned, and tried again. His labors were enormous, but like any well-known figure, his legend didn't stop growing simply because he died, or in his case ascended into the company of gods. The Greeks were not particularly concerned with narrative neatness. Heroes returned in dreams, in cults, in songs hung over the coals of a dying hearth. And Hercules returned most of all, in temples and rituals, in whispered prayers before athletic contests, in moments of fear, and occasionally when no one expected it, as a very real presence. This chapter then tells of his final transformation, not just from man to god, but from living myth to living symbol. For even after his funeral pyre turned to ash, Hercules' work was far from finished. He had simply changed categories. It begins, fittingly, with Olympus. When Hercules arrived on Olympus, his mortal flesh seared away, his divine half risen, there must have been, one imagines, an awkward silence. Hera, queen of the gods and the eternal architect of his suffering, was not exactly known for forgiveness. After all, she had tried to kill him in his cradle. She had driven him mad. She had set monsters in his path with the same casual regularity that one might set wine on a table. And yet something shifted. whether it was compassion, fatigue, or a grudging respect for a man who had, despite her best efforts, survived everything she threw at him. Hera accepted Hercules not only into Olympus, but into her family. She gave him her daughter Hebe, goddess of youth, as a bride, and just like that, the old antagonism dissolved. Not perhaps into love, but at least into ceremony. The marriage of Hercules and Hebe served a symbolic purpose. He, the champion of mortal endurance; she, the personification of immortality. Together, they represented a kind of harmony. The triumph of human effort, rewarded by divine favor. On Olympus, Hercules was a strange fit. Most of the gods lounged, plotted, or occasionally meddled with mortals for sport. Hercules, however, was a man of action, a creature of motion. Even among immortals, he was restless. He did not take easily to lounging on clouded thrones or sipping ambrosia while contemplating the nature of eternity. And so, unsurprisingly, he continued to intervene. There are stories of Hercules descending from Olympus to aid in battles, to help heroes, to guide kings, to judge wrestling matches. His status was complicated. Not quite God, not quite ghost, not quite memory, but always there in parts of Greece, especially in places like Thebes and Argos. Hercules was not just worshipped, he was invited. Shrines were built for him, sacrifices were made, and more unusually, rites were performed to call him down, to ask him to attend. These were not mere devotions. They were invitations for the god to return, to walk again among men, to protect them in moments of trial. One such rite, known as the Heraclea, was celebrated annually in many city-states. It commemorated his death, his burning, and his rebirth. Unlike most festivals for the gods, which emphasize their power and perfection, the Heraclea was about pain and triumph, about the long, scorched road to redemption. His cult grew, and with it, stories multiplied. Some claimed that Hercules now sat among the stars, his lion-skin cloak glittering in the firmament. Others said he walked the roads in disguise, helping travelers and punishing the wicked. And others still, especially the philosophers, began to see him not just as a figure of strength, but as a moral example. The Stoics in particular adored Hercules. To them, he was the embodiment of virtues, the Roman virtue of strength through discipline. Here was a man who had suffered, who had endured hardship after hardship, and who had chosen action over complaint, duty over despair. To live like Hercules was not to be invulnerable, but to be resilient. One philosopher, Musonius Rufus, once said that a man ought to strive for the same strength of character as Hercules. Not the lifting of weights or slaying of beasts, but the courage to do what was necessary, even when one's soul trembled. In this way, Hercules became a bridge, not only between man and God, but between body and soul, between myth and philosophy. He became a kind of spiritual exercise, an ideal of suffering made meaningful by perseverance. The Romans, never once to let a good god go to waste, adopted him wholeheartedly. They transformed Hercules into Hercules Victor, Hercules the Conqueror, a patron of soldiers, travelers, and merchants. Temples were raised to him in Rome, most notably the round temple in the Forum Boarium, where people came to pray for success in business and battle alike. Roman emperors adored the comparison. Commodus, that volatile and theatrical emperor, fancied himself a reincarnation of Hercules. He fought in the arena dressed in lion skins and had statues made in his image. It was, admittedly, not subtle. Others were more restrained. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, spoke often of endurance, and though he didn't claim descent from Hercules, the ideals he preached, calm resolve, ethical action, echoed the Heraclean model in quieter tones. And so, over centuries, Hercules transformed again. He was a hero, then a god, then a symbol, a tale told to children, a prayer whispered by athletes, a statue softened by the rain. His strength remained, of course, always the club, the lion skin, the impossible biceps. But each strength began to mean something different. It wasn't just about violence or victory. It was about surviving, about the patience to carry burdens, the courage to atone, the strange grace of starting again. His image changed with the times. The early Hercules was wild-haired, wide-eyed, a man more beast than god. Later, in the Hellenistic age, He was shown older, heavier, more contemplative, still strong but now weary, a god who had known pain, a hero who had wept, and through all this his labors were never forgotten. Artists returned to them again and again. The lion, the hydra, the stables, the apples, each one became a metaphor, challenges to be overcome, trials to be endured. Personal monsters in mythic disguise, they were painted onto drinking cups, etched into stone, told over and over at dinner parties and temple gatherings and public games, not because they were entertaining, though they certainly were, but because they held something timeless, a structure, a promise that if Hercules could do it, perhaps we could too. Not slay monsters necessarily, but endure the things life throws at us, grief, doubt, fatigue, shame, and emerge still walking, still trying, still ourselves. By the time Christianity began to rise in the Mediterranean world, Hercules had already faded somewhat from daily worship. The temples grew quiet, the sacrifices stopped, but the memory remained, and in curious ways it was absorbed. The image of a suffering savior carrying burdens not his own, descending to the underworld and rising again. One needn't stretch too far to see the shadows he cast across later sacred narratives. Even today, he's still with us. In the gym, where men and women push their limits under posters of muscled heroes. In literature, where flawed protagonists strive for redemption. In philosophy, where we are reminded that virtue is not born in comfort but forged in fire. And in bedtime stories, where strength and sorrow dance side by side, Hercules, it seems, has never truly left. He simply changes shape. One day a statue, one day a star, one day a voice in your head telling you to get up and try again, even when everything aches. His labors are complete, but ours, in a gentler, quieter way, go on. So rest now, dear listener. You've carried enough for today. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow we face our own lions. But tonight you sleep.